So Hargraves notes that auteur theory would fit into this sort of binge watching addictive spectatorship model, but not necessarily in a negative way. There you see Alfred Hitchcock, Orson Welles, Martin Scorsese. These are really well-known film directors with a significant body of work. Um, in the case of people that are tremendous followers of these directors, and that's part of what auteur theory is, that kind of excessive media consumption isn't always framed as a bad thing. People that are really into movies uh, are called cinephiles, so cinephilia, love of movies. Um, the notion of auteur theory is pretty masculinist, given that the vast majority of film directors are men. To be into auteur theory is by default almost to be a follower of male art. Um, the sort of binge watching of films and some television shows based on who created it is what auteur theory is. So, for someone that is a huge fan of Alfred Hitchcock, your fascination is based on the fact that Alfred Hitchcock made that movie. Many people love all of Alfred Hitchcock's movies. That they love all of Orson Welles movies, or all of Martin Scorsese, or all of Francis Ford Coppola. So they will consume vast amounts of those films based on who created them. Now it's much more difficult, sort of, to binge watch, several hour long movies. So if you were, Francis Ford Coppola is a good example, the director that made the Godfather movies and Apocalypse Now. To binge watch all of the Godfather movies would be, a 12-hour experience. So it's a little different when we're talking about film relative to binge watching. Um, Auteur theory is about the aesthetics, so the look and feel of these pieces of art, which happen to be films. There is a similar sort of aesthetic feel to binge watching television shows. If you are binge watching them based on the person who created them. What Hargraves says is that auteur theory lends an interesting conversation about gender, about addiction, and about spectatorship. And we're not going to spend a ton of time on auteur theory, but it is a useful analogy to the arguments being made here about binge watching and addictive spectatorship. Another concept that Hargraves brings to this argument is something called narco-analysis. What narco-analysis does is it stretches the boundaries of what counts as a drug, so beyond just physical substances such as alcohol or hard drugs or recreational drugs. Um, what Hargraves says is that reality TV may well have some drug-like properties in terms of how you think of it relative to addiction. Certainly, within the neoliberal culture, that is an interesting dynamic. On one hand, the neoliberal culture allows the individual to make the choice. At the same time, reality TV, if it is in fact addictive, removes some of that ability to make choice in terms of watching. Um, it is either as a drug, if reality TV is like a drug, it's either inhibiting one's ability to be successful in the world or optimizing one's ability to be successful. Um, Reality TV represents the extremes of personal freedom and responsibility. And if one is addicted to reality TV, that sort of freedom is in question. The question becomes who is driving the desire? Is the individual driving the desire on his or her own, or is reality TV so addictive that that desire is completely unconscious? Uh, Also relative to narco-analysis, so Hargraves frames this as something out of the early 1990s. So that's when that critique, the narcoanalytic critique, came about. Um, the actual neoliberal economic policy really came into form in the early 1990s, and there was a widespread growth in this period of time to the use of psychiatric medication. So a lot of the medications that we think of now are newer than we might think. They don't date back to before the early 1990s. There was also in the early 1990s a shift from the war on drugs to a sort of an individual approach to drug culture. Certainly not where we're at today with sort of more widespread legalization of recreational drugs, but the war on drugs that preceded the 1990s was much harsher, and there was no opportunity for individuals to make choice. All drugs were bad, and all drug users needed to be punished. Um, what came out of narcoanalysis is that addiction is really a disease of the will. That people who are addicted don't have free will anymore. The disease is driving them, not their own personal choices. Um, Narcoanalysis highlights the way in which we talk about addiction as a disease, how we describe it, how we categorize it, and how we regulate it. And this is a linguistic move. This is nothing inherent to addiction and disease, but it's the way in which we understand it. And all of that came about through the popularization of narcoanalysis. Uh, Hargraves also traces a lot of what we see on reality TV back to the television talk show. Um, so what the television talk show did was it popularized the discourse of therapy and self-help. So here, of course, you see Oprah Winfrey from her early talk show. The notion in which we confess and get help from television, Hargraves traces back to the television talk show. Uh, these shows feature narratives of addiction, narratives of recovery. These are shows that were less sensational than something like the Jerry Springer Show or Maury. The notion of addiction was both a spectacle, so something to watch, and also managed through a kind of public therapy by watching it on TV, by hearing from the studio audience. That was the way in which addiction was framed. Hargraves describes talk shows as confessional regimes. And then they very much were, and to a certain degree still are, though we see more of the sort of over-the-top spectacle talk shows. In terms of recovery television, Hargraves offers several examples. So Hoarders, which we've already talked about. Extreme couponing I would put in the category of an interesting choice to add to this article, and not one that I would have put in this category on my own. Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew. My Strange Addiction, which aired on TLC. The OCD Project, which I think aired on VH1. So there were all these shows about people's compulsions and people's addictions and how they were featured on reality TV shows. These behaviors, as opposed to an appearance, how someone looks, is what's outside of the norm of acceptability, what these people are doing. And that the behaviors themselves must be tempered through professional interventions from psychologists or, in the case of hoarders, organizers. Various professional mental health doctors and therapists are the ways in which these behaviors are addressed. The clips that you're going to see, one will be from the show Extreme Couponing, and then the other will be another clip from intervention to, again, give you a sense of what we're talking about here.